The right to vote is one of the most powerful tools in a democracy, a mechanism through which citizens shape the future of their nation. For African Americans, the journey to secure and maintain this right has been long, tumultuous, and fraught with both legal and violent opposition. From the moment voting was first extended to African Americans to the modern-day struggles against voter suppression, the fight for political representation has been central to the African American experience in the United States. When the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1787, voting rights were not extended to all citizens, let alone African Americans, who were largely enslaved at the time. They were regarded as property, not people, and the thought of them participating in a democratic society was unimaginable to many white Americans. Yet, in the years preceding the Civil War, a small number of free black men in some northern states were able to vote, though they were a rare exception. The true battle for African American voting rights began after the Civil War. With the abolition of slavery, the question arose: could a country founded on the principles of freedom deny this basic right to millions of African Americans? The path to securing the vote for African Americans was strewn with obstacles, both legal and physical. In 1865, the Civil War ended, and with it came the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment. However, freedom from bondage did not bring full equality. While African Americans were no longer enslaved, they were still not fully recognized as citizens in many parts of the country. The right to vote, in particular, remained out of reach for most. This changed in 1870 with the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which declared that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This constitutional amendment was a monumental achievement, legally granting African American men the right to vote. With the 15th Amendment in place, a wave of political engagement swept across the South. African American men registered to vote in large numbers, and for the first time, they could participate in the political process that had been denied to them for centuries. During the Reconstruction era, from 1865 to 1877, African Americans not only voted but also won political office, creating a historic moment in American governance. Perhaps the most famous black elected official during this time was Hiram Revels of Mississippi, who became the first African American to serve in the United States Senate. Revels was elected in 1870 to fill a seat that had been vacant since Mississippi's secession at the start of the Civil War. His appointment was met with intense opposition from white Democrats in Congress, who tried to block him from taking his seat. Despite this, Revels served from 1870 to 1871, becoming a symbol of African American political progress during Reconstruction. Another prominent figure was Blanche K. Bruce, also from Mississippi, who followed Revels as the second African American to serve in the United States Senate. Bruce, born into slavery, won his seat in 1874 and served a full 6-year term from 1875 to 1881. He was the first African American to preside over a Senate session and made significant contributions to issues involving black education and land reform. Although Bruce was not forced out of office, his career marked the high point of black political power during Reconstruction, a period that would soon see a steep decline in African American representation due to increasing disenfranchisement. At the state level, African Americans held various offices. In South Carolina, for example, Robert Smalls, a former enslaved man who became a war hero for commandeering a Confederate ship and delivering it to Union forces, was elected to the United States House of Representatives. Smalls served 5 terms between 1875 and 1887, advocating for public education and equal rights. However, like many African Americans in political office during Reconstruction, Smalls faced growing resistance from white supremacists determined to strip African Americans of their newfound political power. He was eventually forced out of office due to violent intimidation and voter suppression in the South. Another notable figure was PBS Pinchback, who became the first African American to serve as governor of a United States state. Pinchback was the acting governor of Louisiana from December 1872 to January 1873, after the incumbent was impeached. His brief tenure as governor is a powerful reminder of the fleeting nature of African American political influence during this period. These men were not the only African Americans to hold political office during Reconstruction. In fact, over 2,000 African American men were elected to local, state, and federal positions during this era. They worked to pass laws that protected civil rights, advocated for education, and sought to rebuild the South on a foundation of equality. However, their time in office was often brief, and they faced relentless opposition. As federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, marking the end of Reconstruction, the era of African American political power in the South was effectively over. White supremacist groups and Southern Democrats worked to undo the gains of Reconstruction, using violence and discriminatory laws to force African Americans out of office. The political gains made during Reconstruction were met with a fierce and violent backlash. As federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, following the Compromise of 1877, white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan unleashed a campaign of terror designed to intimidate and discourage black voters. Alongside this violence, Southern lawmakers devised legal strategies to strip African Americans of their voting rights. Among the most insidious tactics were poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, each designed to disenfranchise African Americans. Poll taxes required citizens to pay a fee to vote. Though it might seem like a simple charge, this tax was specifically designed to disenfranchise African Americans, many of whom lived in poverty due to systemic discrimination and the lingering effects of slavery. The poll tax was often set at a high enough rate that it made voting an unaffordable luxury for many black Americans. In a region where poverty was rampant among African Americans, the poll tax served as an effective tool to keep them away from the polls. Poll taxes remained in effect for decades until they were abolished by the 24th Amendment in 1964. Literacy tests were another tactic used to prevent African Americans from voting. These tests required voters to demonstrate their ability to read and write, but they were rarely straightforward. Often, the tests involved complex and intentionally confusing questions, or voters were asked to interpret difficult and obscure passages of the United States Constitution. In many cases, even highly educated African Americans were arbitrarily failed, as the administration of the tests was left to local officials who were often openly hostile to black voters. The tests were applied in such a way that made it nearly impossible for African Americans to pass. Meanwhile, white voters were frequently given simpler tests or none at all, ensuring that African Americans were disproportionately affected. To further solidify white political dominance, many Southern states passed grandfather clauses. These laws allowed people to bypass literacy tests and poll taxes if their grandfathers had been eligible to vote before the Civil War. Since African Americans were enslaved and had no voting rights before the war, this effectively excluded nearly all black citizens from voting, while enabling poor and illiterate white citizens to cast their ballots freely. These tactics were devastatingly effective for several reasons. First, they created legal barriers that African Americans could not easily overcome. Poll taxes preyed on economic hardship, while literacy tests exploited the fact that African Americans had been denied access to education during slavery and segregation. Second, these laws were crafted to appear neutral on the surface, applying to everyone in theory, but in practice, they were applied in a way that specifically targeted African Americans. Finally, these legal strategies worked in tandem with violent intimidation from white supremacist groups, ensuring that even if African Americans managed to overcome the legal barriers, they still faced the threat of physical harm for attempting to vote. By the early 20th century, these tactics had effectively stripped African Americans of their voting rights in the South, and the hope of political representation that had blossomed during Reconstruction was all but extinguished. Historically, African Americans were staunch supporters of the Republican Party. Founded in the 1850s on an anti-slavery platform, the Republican Party, led by Abraham Lincoln, was seen as the party of freedom and emancipation. African Americans continued to support the Republican Party throughout the Reconstruction era and well into the early 20th century, even as they faced disenfranchisement in the South. However, the political landscape began to shift during the 1930s, driven largely by the economic devastation of the Great Depression. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs provided economic relief to struggling Americans, including African Americans, and this helped to win over black voters. Though the Democratic Party had long been associated with Southern segregationists, many African Americans, especially in the North, began to see the Democrats as the party of economic opportunity. The real shift in African American political allegiance occurred during the 1960s, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Democratic President John F. Kennedy expressed support for civil rights, but it was his successor, President Lyndon B. Johnson, who fully embraced the cause. Under Johnson's leadership, the Democratic Party passed landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a particularly transformative piece of legislation. It outlawed the discriminatory practices that had disenfranchised African Americans for nearly a century, including literacy tests and poll taxes, and it placed certain jurisdictions, mostly in the South, under federal oversight. For the first time since Reconstruction, African Americans were able to vote freely in large numbers, and voter registration surged. As the Democratic Party increasingly became the party of civil rights, African Americans shifted their support away from the Republican Party. Meanwhile, the Republican Party began to adopt a Southern strategy, appealing to Southern white voters who opposed desegregation. This realignment solidified in the 1960s and 70s, and from that point on, African Americans overwhelmingly supported the Democratic Party. Despite the progress made by the Voting Rights Act, efforts to suppress the African American vote have not disappeared. In recent years, several states have passed laws that critics argue are designed to disenfranchise African Americans. Voter ID laws, voter roll purges, reductions in early voting periods, and the closure of polling places in predominantly black neighborhoods are among the tactics used to limit African American voter participation. One of the most significant setbacks to voting rights came in 2013, when the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder invalidated a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. This provision had required states with a history of racial discrimination to obtain federal approval before changing their voting laws. Without this oversight, several states passed laws that disproportionately affected African American voters. For African Americans, the right to vote has been hard-fought and hard-won. From the days of slavery to the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights Movement, the struggle for political representation has been a central part of their fight for equality. Voting is more than just a civic duty. It is the most direct way for African Americans to influence policies, elect leaders, and hold those leaders accountable. African American voter participation remains crucial today. History has shown that when African Americans vote, they can effect significant change, from electing black officials to advancing civil rights legislation. The power of the black vote has been a force for justice and progress in the United States, and it remains a vital tool for shaping the future. The fight for African American voting rights is far from over. Although significant progress has been made since the days of Jim Crow, modern-day voter suppression tactics still threaten to undermine the gains of the civil rights movement. African Americans must remain vigilant and continue to exercise their right to vote, not only to honor the struggles of the past, but to safeguard the future of democracy.